It's no ordinary political podcast.
I want this to be a fun, informative way for people to find out the latest and greatest in Georgia political news.
Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
We want to take people inside the deals, inside the decisions.
Political insiders Greg Bluestein and Patricia Murphy lead the AJC's team of journalists at the legislature and Washington.
For the nation, Georgia could really set the tone on so many different issues.
We want to make it easy and fun to listen and learn about politics.
Know what's really going on with Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Listen every Wednesday and Friday, wherever you get your podcasts.
Today on CityCast Denver. 2 years ago, Colorado said yes to reintroducing wolves to the Western Slope. Urban voters loved the idea. Ranchers hated it. But we voted for it, and now we finally have some sense of how it will actually work. Because last week, Colorado Parks and Wildlife published their long-awaited wolf drop plan. CPR reporter Sam Brash is on today to explain how our vote could impact our state's landscape. Today is Wednesday, December 14th, 2022. I'm Bree Davies, and this is CityCast Denver. Sam Brash, welcome back to CityCast Denver.
Glad to be here as always.
So Sam, I'd love for you to explain how we got here. Why does Colorado need to be reintroducing wolves in the first place?
I think that's a question of how far back you want to go, but let's just go back to the most logical place. The reason we're here right now is because in 2020, Colorado voters very narrowly passed a ballot initiative called Proposition 114. And this initiative essentially did two things. It ordered the state to reintroduce wolves somewhere on the Western Slope by 2024, and it said the state had to fairly compensate for any lost livestock that the wolves might, prey upon. That's all it said, and it was part of this bigger effort to kind of renew wolf conservation in the Rocky Mountain West. You might know that wolves were already reintroduced in Idaho and Yellowstone National Park, but state governments up in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, they've turned against the species. So this was seen as a way to sort of revitalize the project and create a single wolf migration corridor all the way from Canada to Mexico through the Rocky Mountains.
Can you explain to me why folks want wolves to repopulate? What does that have to do with Colorado or just our everyday experience here?
I think there's a few reasons there. One is totally biological and science-based. Wolves are a top predator, and there's an idea that when top predators are on a landscape, whole ecosystems are a lot healthier. There's this famous video that a lot of scientists have now questioned called How Wolves Save Rivers. But the basic idea is that when wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone, they pushed elk and deer herds away from waterways, which let vegetation regrow, allowed beavers to move back in. This is a very simplified story, and more work on trophic cascades say it's way more complicated than this. But it's one example where scientists think, hey, maybe having a predator back on the landscape, it encourages biodiversity and a healthy ecosystem. I'd say the other reason is pretty political. I mean, the eradication of wolves in the 19th and early 20th century was a project of white settler expansion across the West. It was one of the ways that this whole region became, a place where ranching was prioritized as an industry and raising livestock was prioritized in an industry. And it's a political symbol in that way, as a way to sort of go back to a more wild version of North America. And I think it's a political symbol, too, in a way a lot of people might not think about. Wolves are not usually a kind of species that states are very good at managing. Top predators, they, feed on other animals that states like Colorado sell hunting licenses for. And so this was a way to sort of force Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the state in general to prioritize a top predator like wolves.
So you're kind of getting at this, but I'd love to look at sort of the two sides of this fight when we think about who is for and who is against wolf reintroduction.
The two sides here are conservationists on one side who see wolves as a really important piece of the ecosystem that has been pulled away by human interference. And on the other side, ranchers who worried that those wolves are going to feed on their cattle, and hunters who worried that those wolves are going to decrease the availability of deer and elk that they hunt each fall and put meat into their freezers each winter.
And I want to fast forward to now because Colorado Parks and Wildlife has just shared this draft plan on how wolf reintroduction is going to happen. But before we get to the plan itself, can you tell me how the plan came together? It sounds like these folks that you've just talked about, these two sides have had to kind of work together to make this plan.
They have. So what the state did after Colorado passed this ballot initiative is it formed two different working groups. One was called the Technical Working Group, which everyone abbreviated to the TWIG. The other was the Stakeholder Advisory Group, which was the SAG. So we got the TWIG and the SAG. The TWIG's job was to figure out kind of the science of wolf reintroduction. The SAG's job was to figure out the human impacts of wolf reintroduction, like what happens when they feed on cattle and stuff like that. They met for months to recommend policies. Those came out, over the last year. And then Colorado Parks and Wildlife worked for even more months to put together this final plan. And the members of those advisory committees are conservationists, ranchers, hunters, anybody who really has an interest of the wolves was sitting on it. And this was supposed to be sort of a consensus plan that the state could actually implement. What it doesn't include is other groups like Wild Earth Guardians and the Center for Biological Diversity. They weren't sitting on these panels, and they've been very critical of this plan, mainly because they think it doesn't start with enough wolves and it doesn't set targets for the wolf population to grow to a point where it would be self-sustaining in the state. So it's a consensus among the groups that worked on it, but there is a large contingent of groups who think it doesn't go far enough.
Okay, that's fair. That's good to make it clear because it's not just like, we disagreed, now we came together. It's like, it's complicated.
Absolutely not.
This episode is brought to you by the How to Buy a Home podcast. Because for the first time in 5 years, there's a house in my neighborhood for sale for $300,000. That's nuts. And that's just a sneak preview of 2023, which could be the year of the first-time home buyer. A lot of people are predicting a recession, and that could mean buyers have more power, less cutthroat competition, and more homes on the market that could get more affordable. If you haven't listened to the How to Buy a Home podcast, now is the perfect time. Host David Sidoni is an industry expert who has helped thousands of people just like you all over North America buy their first homes. Since 2005, David has been the undisputed first-time homebuyer authority. His How to Buy a Home podcast has helped so many listeners close on houses they thought were impossible, even as things went nuts in the past couple of years. Start planning this holiday season at howtobuyahome.com and make this the last year you rent. Find How to Buy a Home on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts.
This episode is sponsored by State Farm. Buying insurance can be complicated, and you might have a lot of questions, like, what if my policy doesn't cover that? Or, what if I need to make a claim in the middle of the night? Good news, State Farm is there for all your what-ifs. You can reach them 24/7, talk through any questions with your agent, and you can even file a claim on the State Farm mobile app. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Call or go to statefarm.com to get a quote today.
So, Sam, last week, Colorado Parks and Wildlife published their plan to reintroduce wolves to Colorado. What's the plan?
So the top line here is that the state is planning to release 30 to 50 wolves over the next 3 to 5 years. That gives them a lot of flexibility, right? And it can also recalibrate, all kinds of things based on how those wolves behave, including, Colorado Parks and Wildlife says it's really important that it has the legal power to kill wolves if it needs to. And that's another thing that's really upset that contingent of environmental groups that don't love everything about this plan.
Is the ability to use lethal means to sort of fight back against the wolves, right? That's a point of contention here.
Absolutely. Yeah. The state is saying if wolves are, feeding on too many cows, if they've, say, moved into Aspen and are killing pets, they should have the ability to kill those animals. And right now, they absolutely do not. Wolves are a federally endangered protected species in Colorado, so they need to get permission from the federal government first to put this plan into action and have the power to do that.
And they're calling the plan an impact-based approach, which is kind of vague. What is an impact-based approach? Like, what does that mean?
What they're really getting at is the main factor in the overall success of wolves on the landscape. It's not going to be the biology and the habitat that Colorado has to offer. We have the largest elk herd in the world. About 280,000 elk live here in the state. So we have incredible wolf habitat, and pretty much biologists agree that once they're here, they're going to repopulate pretty quickly. When they say impact-based, they're saying the biggest factor is going to be how people react to wolves on the landscape. And they want to make sure that they think about those impacts, what they're going to be, and can they mitigate them, can they reduce them, and can they really promote coexistence between wolves and people.
And I want to get back to that in a minute, but I know this is going to be hard to just like encapsulate in a short conversation, but I'm assuming they're not just going to just dump a couple dozen wolves and let them run free. Like, how does wolf reintroduction work according to this plan?
Well, I think one sort of funny thing is that actual wolf reintroduction, that is how it works. It's outlined in the plan. You open a truck and you let them go, right? Like the actual reintroduction itself is a pretty simple process. But you're right. A lot of things need to happen after that. The wolves need to be tracked. They need to be managed. And that's a whole process. Like they have to attach GPS collars to the wolves when they're let free, maybe recapture them if they have pups to attach collars to those animals. And then there's all these other things to consider. What happens when they kill a cattle? How much is that compensated? How do you work with ranchers to reduce the possibility of conflicts in the first place? How do you make sure that wolves aren't feeding on too many deer and elk and leaving none for hunters to go after themselves, or shifting the overall ecosystem in a way there's just not enough elk and deer, period.
Where do the wolves go? Because it was just very broad. It's like the Western Slope, but like where do wolves go when we reintroduce them?
Yeah, so the plan says wolves should go in this thing called the donut hole. And what Colorado Parks and Wildlife did is they said, well, we don't want these wolves to immediately run off into New Mexico or Utah or Wyoming. So we're going to reintroduce them 60 miles from each state border on the Western Slope. So that creates an area that includes Vail, Glenwood, Montrose, and Gunnison. And then the plan said they're going to try to reintroduce them in the northern section of that donut hole. What that means is that the first release of wolves next year is going to occur somewhere along the I-70 corridor between Glenwood and Vail. So some of the most populated places in the mountains near some of our most popular ski resorts will be the first wolf habitat.
That's crazy, but that's a great thing to think about. How do you decide where? And
part of the way they're deciding, back to your question on like impact-based approaches, is they had someone look into not only what's the best habitat for wolves, but where are people most open to the species. To figure that out, they actually looked at the vote totals in different precincts and created maps that showed, okay, this area over here voted more for reintroduction. We should probably think about reintroducing there first, as opposed to this part of Colorado that we know is very against this idea.
But they won't be coming to Denver or Boulder anytime soon.
Who knows? Wolves move so quickly on the landscape. And so after this reintroduction, it is a matter of time before they reach the Front Range.
So you kind of brought this up when we're talking about the impact-based approach. What does the plan call for if a wolf attacks a rancher's cow or maybe someone's dog?
Ranchers in this whole discussion were really concerned about indirect losses. So when they say that, what they mean is that a wolf kills a cow right now, or if an elk eats your hay, you can claim the market value of that lost property from the state, and it's compensated at market value. They think that living near wolves creates all kinds of other costs that isn't just the market value of a lost animal. So that might be, putting up fencing that you didn't have to put up earlier, or things like some studies suggesting, cows might have a harder time gaining weight or might have lower birth weights living around wolves. So how do you account for those losses? We're taking the approach that most other states, in this proposal at least, that, ranchers will have an option to have their losses multiplied. up to 7-1 the market value of that calf or that sheep if they lose that to a wolf.
Interesting. I think that shows the impacts of this kind of legislation is like the legislation itself is one component, but then how it's implemented and what it may inevitably cost the state is a whole other story once it gets rolled out.
Yeah, I think the ballot initiative itself, when I was talking to my sources back in 2020, they said this is a very simple proposition. Because to voters, it's just we're basically voting on, are wolves cool? And most people are think wolves are pretty cool. And so that passes barely. But then there's all these questions about like, what does that mean? How does this actually work? And that was the way it was designed, right? Like there is a contingent of people who supported that ballot initiative who think the way we've done wildlife management in North America for about a century is wrong, that we need to start giving voters more power instead of scientists. So voters set kind of the broad prerogative, like bring wolves back, and then scientists figure out how to make that happen.
So what is next? The plan has been made public. Like, where do we go from here? Or when will we see the wolves actually being reintroduced?
That part is easy. So we're going to see the wolves reintroduced probably next December, so like a year from now. Under the original ballot initiative, it needs to happen by 2024. So pretty clear deadline, and you can really only release wolves in the winter. So we're looking at probably December of next year.
Okay, so by this time next year, we may have some answers. We may see how things are going.
Yeah, and I personally hope to be there the moment they open up the truck and the wolves run free.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to be here.
And here's what else Denverites are talking about. United Airlines and their mega purchase. The Denver Post reports that the city's largest private employer just bought 100 Boeing 787 Dreamliners. The 787s are mainly used for international flights, so this could mean even more international routes out of DIA soon. The big buy comes as United is expanding their footprint in Denver, and they plan to be operating 90 gates at DIA by the end of 2023. And to follow up on a story we brought you earlier, the Richard Crowther House in Cherry Creek will not be saved from demolition. According to Denverite, City Council voted 8-2 against historic designation, with Councilwomen Debbie Ortega and Candice de Baca voting in favor of saving the structure. Crowther passed away in 2006. Fellow architects pushed for the designation in an effort to save his environmentally conscious architecture. But it looks like the current owners, MAG Builders, will have their chance to redevelop the pricey piece of Denver real estate instead. That's all for today here on CityCast Denver. If you enjoyed the show, why not take a minute to tell your favorite rancher about us? Rate the show wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe to our morning newsletter, Hey Denver, by texting Denver to 66866. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye-bye. Listen. What I bet it's coming from is every game show for kids on Nickelodeon was like a prize package to Hawaii or something. And it would be like, brought to you by United, fly the friendly skies, so it's like ingrained in my brain.